Hello, and welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Randles Bentwaters UFO incident, John Burroughs, and Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe. And now, leading off the program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Jenny Randles is a British author who served in 1982 through 1994 as Director of Investigations with the British UFO Research Association known as BUFORA. She was born on October 30th, 1951, and in her 64 years, she has produced 50 published books, ranging from Life After Death, ESP, Crop Formations, Mysteries of Time and Other Dimensions, to UFOs. She also worked with fellow British UFO researchers Dot Street and Brenda Butler in the early 1980s to investigate the complex UK phenomena that the world has now come to know as the Rendlesham Forest incident near the RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge Air Base in December 26 to 28, 1980. Focusing on the Rendlesham military mystery, the three women worked together to co-write Sky Crash, a cosmic conspiracy released in 1984. 7 years later, in 1991, Jenny Randles produced another book entitled, quote, From Out of the Blue, The Incredible UFO Cover-Up at Bentwaters NATO Air Base, close quote. She began with the eyewitness account of a Woodbridge resident not under military control. His name is Gordon Levitt, and Jenny included a photograph of him in the book, stating that around midnight, as Christmas changed to December 26, 1980, he was the first, quote, who saw the unidentified object arrive directly above his head, not knowing that it would end up in one of the most controversial close encounters of all time, close quote. Gordon Levitt told Jenny Randles that his normally peaceful dog rebelled against being put in the shed and seemed to be upset by something that Gordon could not see. Outside in the cold air with his dog, Gordon looked up into the sky facing Aldeburgh and Sizewell on the North Sea coast, a few miles east of Woodbridge and Rendlesham Forest. Jenny Randles wrote on page 9 of her book, quote, Gordon Levitt drew in his breath. The glow in the sky was so bright, so extraordinary. He knew immediately that this thing was from the north, not from the eastern coast. As the shining mass moved perceptibly in their direction, Gordon was aware that the usually implacable guard dog was shaking and trembling. This thing, whatever it was, seemed so different from any normal object that it provoked fear by its very presence. The air around him crackled with an eerie, invisible energy, close quote. Gordon Levitt told Jenny Randles that the UFO overhead quickly moved above him and his dog, and he estimated the size was about 2 times the height of his rooftop. Gordon described for Jenny Randles that, quote, the thing in the sky was shaped like a giant mushroom, except that from the underside it seemed to be an enormous oval plate. The color was brilliant white, almost fluorescent, and tinged with the faintest trace of green. It poured out light, but the rural surroundings were not illuminated by that light. This paradox confused Gordon. It made no sense. He had watched many aircraft fly over from the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, but this was no aircraft. There was no sign of any doors, windows, or propulsion system. There was also no way of telling exactly how long it stayed above the roof. It may have just been seconds, but seemed like hours. Time had lost all meaning, as man, dog, and miracle were locked in close embrace, and then it was over. The thing drifted away without the slightest whisper of noise and was gone, behind the trees, heading in the direction of RAF Woodbridge, close quote. Then Jenny goes forward in her book to 40 miles north at an Eastern radar office in Norfolk. There, civil and military air traffic controllers worked together to control overflights across a sector of eastern England. All employees had to sign the Official Secrets Act to work with radar there. Around 1 a.m. local time on December 26th, an hour after Gordon Levitt had seen the astonishing aerial craft near Woodbridge, radar operators were tracking a target on the scope that seemed to be a solid object about the size of a Boeing 737, moving at 1,500 knots before slowing down to 900 knots and descending. They checked with London Air Traffic Control Center at West Drayton in Middlesex. They knew nothing about the blip, but they did confirm 2 other military bases had reported an anomaly, a blip that went down into that big Rendlesham forest near RAF Bentwaters. There, for the next 72 hours, several military personnel, including our host, John Burroughs, were eyewitnesses to unidentified aerial lights and beams. A few others even described non-humans. After this brief commercial break, UK investigator and author Jenny Randles will join us on Phenomenon Radio.
You're listening to Phenomenon Radio Live exclusively on KGRARadio.com with Bentwaters experiencer John Burroughs and Emmy award-winning investigative journalists and Earthfiles reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe. Brenda Butler and Dodge Street are on deck. Our guest up first is Jenny Randles. And to start the show, here's John Burroughs. John?
Thank you, Race. Jenny, I want to thank you for coming on the program tonight. Hey, let's start with how you first heard about this case and move forward from there.
Hi, yes, it's something that happened out of the blue. I got a call from a friend who was another author. He didn't write about anything to do with UFOs at all, who had met someone in a local pub in East Anglia and had said that they'd had this strange experience and would they share it with them. And he didn't know what to make of the story and passed it on to me and said, I think this is something you'd better investigate. It turned out to be a civilian radar officer who was working at this base called Woodbridge or Eastern Radar, which coordinated a large area for military and civil traffic location. This is probably about 40, 50 miles north of Rendlesham Forest and a bit to the west as well. And they had this experience, which he didn't directly witness on the night of the events, where they had tracked an object and reported it. And then they decided that they needed to get some kind of official confirmation of this, and they talked to other radar sources and discovered that some other people had made contact with it as well. And they then got contacted by the US Air Force, asking for permission to come to view the radar tape, assess them, and see if it matched an experience that had been happening on Bentwaters Woodbridge base over that particular weekend. Obviously, they were given permission to do that, and some days later, into January of 1981, they came along, officers from both the US Air Force and the British government, RAF, military personnel, and they accessed all this data and took it away. They told the staff at Woodbridge base at that time, including the person who I spoke to, that the reason that they needed this was because of an extraordinary experience, which they then went on to describe in some details which was strange that they would share when taking away this radar tape, and details that did not become common knowledge about the case until many years later, but it included all the aspects of the sighting on the second night, in particular, including details such as the fact that it was tape recorded. So we had all of that information given to us by this source, before the end of January 1981, before the case was even public knowledge of any kind at all. And I, of course, had no way of knowing whether this was just a strange story, a rumour, anything like that. I had to make some discreet inquiries, and they had to be discreet inquiries because that witness did not want his name to be revealed, frightened of breaking the Official Secrets Act by telling us even as much as he did. And he would not tell me the name of the other person who had actually had the radar tracking experience itself on the night when the events occurred. But from that, I contacted Woulton. I tried to get information from them as to whether they'd had any radar tracking, whether they'd had any contact like this. And they wanted to know how I knew what I was asking about. And there was hushed silence on the other end of the line. And I quickly realized that I was in danger here of getting this particular person into trouble if I wasn't careful, and had to drop the inquiry. At that stage, of course, I had absolutely no way of knowing that there was anything of any substance to this, and that the case was going to develop into the amazing story that it did. That only came about a few days later, when I discovered from one of the investigation coordinators in the area that they had been in touch with Brenda Butler and Dot Street, and that they had had some local stories from people around the forest that knew that something was going on, and that they had talked to someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness. And suddenly I could put two and two together and realise there was a case here and start digging into it. And that's where the investigation really began. We coordinated ourselves together, and several years later we were in a position to write a book about what we found.
Jenny, on page 100 in From Out of the Blue, you said, quote, one of the security police officers who was on duty by the East Gate called me anonymously in November of 1984, and it was about that there had been photographs, and that this security guard told you, quote, we took several pictures on the second night, but most of them came out all black. And then you said there was a John Cadbury who also discussed photographs with you. Were you ever able, even if you haven't been able to make them public, have you ever been able to see any of the alleged photographs of craft or beings or lights or anything?
No, those stories certainly were prolific right from the start. Brenda and Dot were told similar things very early days, and it was a constant theme throughout the case that photographs were taken. But I have never seen any of the photographs, and I've never come close to finding anyone who had them or claimed to have them in their possession at that point. The common pattern was that they said that the photographs either did not come out and there was nothing on them, or that they were taken away from them. But yes, there are alleged to be photographs.
What do you think about that story that Mike Verona, who had been at the site of the tripod marks on December 26th and took photographs? We see that photograph. We've all seen it with the Suffolk County police officer, the tripod marks in the ground that were marked by the sticks. And I believe it's Mike Verona that is in the photo. And that the story was that he hand carried the film that was supposed to have been taken and still negatives directly to Gordon Williams, who then flew it to Ramstein.
Yes, we heard similar things to that in the early days as well from around the base. It was a common story about people on the base, but it was always very difficult separating truth from what was just a rumour that was spreading around, because once this case happened, of course, everybody on the base was talking about it. And many of the witnesses, in fact, most of the actual direct witnesses, were reluctant to come forward at that stage, understandably so. And so that was the big problem when we were writing Sky Crash. Probably about 50% of it is completely wrong. But there are bits in there that actually later you can see we had a very close grasp on the truth, and we were getting near to the reality, and we were talking to people who were directly involved. And it stands out now very clearly when you read it, which bits are which. But at that time, we had no way of knowing this because the case was unraveling very, very gradually. And at that stage, of course, we didn't even have the correct dates, and that was confusing everybody, because the dates on the memo that was sent to the Ministry of Defence by Colonel Holt misled the Ministry of Defence and everybody else who investigated from that point onwards in terms of the dating of the incident that happened.
Right.
Jenny, that's something that in your book, Out of the Blue, when you first made contact and started talking to people, what was the dates that they were saying the incident took place, and around what time did it start?
The very first date we ever got, and this would be early January, was for the early hours of the 26th of December, so on basically Christmas night. A date that conflicted with all the subsequent reports, and in fact that particular person, a source on base who I don't think was a direct witness but was passing on information from someone else who was, they changed their mind subsequently and matched the story to the date that subsequently came out. But I think that the date that they had there was the correct date that they'd accidentally given us right from the start. And it was a while before we were able to realise that when we got those dates, we could identify genuine witnesses from ones who were probably just basing their stories on rumours that were coming out of the base. It was always two specific nights. It was that first one, and it was the events that followed in the wake of the party at Woodbridge. And those were the only two that were ever significantly talked about. Now, obviously, we can surmise that there were other incidents, pockets of airmen who went out at various points over the period afterwards because of the knowledge that things were being seen out there, and they may have had experiences. But those two appear to be the most significant two events that we were told about consistently throughout.
And Jenny, I'm looking at that document that Halt signed and dated January 13th, 1981, that he it was on Department of Air Force stationery, the subject unexplained lights. It was directed to the Royal Air Force, and it started in the very first words. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, Deputy Base Commander, said, early in the morning of 27 December 1980 at approximately 3 a.m. And what you're saying is that came out and once it did, other people began trying to accommodate their dates to that opening sentence in a memo, which we all know now that was wrong. It was incorrect. And I've often wondered, do you think that Colonel Halt was ordered to make everything seemingly consolidate on one night, the 27th, when it was actually 72 hours of phenomena from after midnight, the 26th, to after midnight on the 28th?
I think it's possible that there was an element of that, but I suspect mostly it was just confusion, because Colonel Halt obviously was going to focus most on his own direct experience and the one where the majority of airmen were involved. And somehow in his mind, maybe that meant the date of the event got cemented as the evening of the 27th, and somehow he misdated it or didn't accurately in exact words describe in that memo what the date was. But you've also got to remember that was sent really almost as a kind of stop to keep the British government happy, because the base was effectively under tenancy from the British government, and although it was entirely staffed by Americans, it had a British commander with, in effect, just a kind of liaison between the base itself and the British government. And he was the one to whom the memo was given, and he was the one who sent it to the British government, and it found its way to the Air Staff Department in the Ministry of Defence in London, approximately on about the 16th or 17th of January. Now, that's interesting because they then didn't do anything for a few days, and it was quite some time before they had any documentation at all, something we now know because they have released all the documentation many years later, the alleged complete file on the Randles and Forest investigation, so you can trace all the pattern of these dates. That, though, has to be matched against the fact that I got this call about the radar tracking about the same time. So in other words, the same week that this document supposedly landed at the Ministry of Defence. And from that point onwards, they have always claimed they started an investigation and didn't even know about the case prior to that. However, if that's true, then how on earth did I get that call, I talked to someone who knew all the details of an actual investigation that had been there when people had come along and taken away the radar tapes and started to analyse them. That should have happened several weeks later, but I'd already spoken to him by the time the first information supposedly found its way to the Ministry of Defence.
Right, and we know today from Colonel Halt himself, at least John and I sat across from him in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. This was about 5 years ago, and he looked right at us and said that he knew within 24 hours of the first events that the National Security Agency of the United States took over the investigation.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that higher levels of the British government did too. The department at the MOD that supposedly releases all these files does release the files insofar as they're concerned, but they don't get involved to any significant degree in cases that go beyond their level of clearance. And I think this one very clearly did.
Now, Jenny, one of the things that was reported, and I was just back there about a year and a half ago, and some of the locals that I was able to speak to around the area stated that shortly afterwards, I mean, they've been labeled a Men in Black, but there was an investigative team that was down there. It appears there's possibly been two teams, one scientific and one having to do with the military, including the individual, and I don't have his name on the tip of my tongue, that was in charge of the forest division at the time, said they were visited by people from the MOD. Were you ever able to substantiate that took place? And if so, what did you learn?
We certainly talked to many people within weeks after the sighting of who had been visited. They had seen the forest almost cordoned off for a time. There were areas which were regarded as no-go, and there were teams which appeared to be doing some kind of a forensic investigation. There is absolutely nothing in the official stated record of the British government to confirm that, and they have always denied that any such thing occurred. So we do not know where they came from to this day. The problem with the British government is there are many little shadowy parts of investigation which don't necessarily have the same degree of openness as is supposedly created by a Freedom of Information Act. And getting access to them is extremely difficult. And there are still files about the case that have not yet been released. And who knows what's on them. And I think the problem is they've probably filed the ones that matter in places where no one will actually inquire for them because they will be labelled in some way that's not directly connected with UFOs at all.
Okay. Now, one of the other questions, because there's been a lot of discussion on exactly where the site was. Early on, did you get taken out to the area where the pictures were taken and where the site allegedly was, based on also Colonel Halt in an interview a few years later stating there was numerous sites created after the event. So do you feel that you went to the site that where our incident took place and Colonel Halt was out investigating the night before all the other stuff started happening that was recorded on the tape recorder?
Well, I did at the time, and I've obviously got an open mind as to whether that's the case. Certainly there were false sites. I mean, there was a site that was found not long afterwards and well before the case became public knowledge, which had a giant arrow scratched in the ground next to it, almost like to say, go there. And that was not the location that everybody else was talking about. So there was a degree of distraction. But we talked to, there was a house nearby that was owned by a local gamekeeper and his family. And they were present during the events, and they saw something of which I have no doubt because I talked to them, and I talked specifically with the father being away to his daughter, and she was desperate to tell me of her own experience, and her father was doing everything to stop her talking about it. She was very keen to know what it was that had come over the area and that they had seen, but clearly her father was really scared of getting involved in this.
Jenny, where was the arrow carved in or scratched into the ground in relationship to Capel Green?
I can't answer that question. That's a question you'll have to ask of either Brenda or Dot. They are much more knowledgeable about the local area than I am. I mean, it's been many years since I've been there because of my domestic situation nowadays where I have had to more or less give up investigating because I've become a full-time carer. for my mother.
Did you know at the time if you were near Capel Green?
Oh, yes.
So if you think of that tree line and the open space, and there is that finger of trees that comes in between the big field and Capel Green, were you near there?
Yes, we'd gone down the logging track into that area just before the clearing. You could see the Shipwash lightship off to the right, down towards the south, and you could just about make out the lights on one of the buildings on Orford Ness through the trees, and you could see the lighthouse. But they were all pretty obvious for what they were from that location.
Well, do you remember there was a house that was right near where the finger of trees extended, separating the big farm from Capel Green, and then, so there was that house, and then as you kept extending, going down the farm field, there were a couple of other houses. Do you remember which house was the one where the woman was so agitated?
It was the one more or less directly in line of sight between that field and beyond it, where you could see the lights on Orford Ness.
So it was the one at the end of that finger of trees that separated? Yeah, that's what we wondered when we were there in December of 2010. And it is interesting to hear you, even though you don't remember where that arrow was, it sounds like the arrow would have been on the Capel Green side or the forest side.
Jenny, I want to follow. I have to ask this question because it's become lore in the case. Okay, we've been accused of starting from the east gate, going out into the forest, into the fields. Okay, that the whole thing was simply the lighthouse and planets and stars. Now, the locals that you talk to, that know the area, know the lighthouse, do you feel A, they were fooled by the lighthouse, and B, do you feel at any point, and what I mean by any point is that the lighthouse would have been what we were dealing with and what we were seeing?
Okay, I do think that the lighthouse had a part to play in this case. I think some of the people who went out into the forest afterwards, attracted by all the attention to the case, saw it, didn't realise what it was, and were fooled. Possibly more likely fooled by the fact that the Shipwash lightship was there too. And so there were two lighthouses, so to speak. So even if they knew that there was a lighthouse, they may have not realised that there were two. But I have absolutely no doubt at all that the lighthouse was not what you saw or what was the primary cause of these events. I have talked to too many local witnesses who've lived in the area for years, have always seen the lighthouse day in, day out, under all kinds of weather conditions. They knew exactly what it would look like, and they have said that the events of that weekend were unlike anything they had ever witnessed before. And I've also talked to the lighthouse keeper himself, who says that he is pretty certain from the accounts that have been given that nothing his lighthouse could ever do could have caused what we witnessed.
And Jenny, I read from your book about the Gordon Levitt eyewitness account, because anyone who would testify to what he testifies to is talking about a very large craft right above him that would have absolutely nothing to do with the lighthouse. And in fact, the direction, he knew the direction that would have been east, and this was coming from the north.
Yes. And also bear in mind that the kind of thing that he saw was not unique either to his sighting or to the events during the actual weekend when the Rendlesham Forest case occurred. This area has been prone to this kind of thing for years. There are other witnesses. I've talked to fishermen who saw the same thing coming up out of the ocean between the mainland and or the Orford Ness. There is also, of course, the case involving the postman who saw something with his dog on the beach right next to the Sizewell nuclear power station, where this came up along the beach from the ocean, terrified the dog, made the dog run for miles, and which gave him very similar physiological experiences to what happened to some of the witnesses involved in Rendlesham Forest. So this is a kind of phenomenon that seems to have been prevalent in that area for quite a while before the Rendlesham Forest case occurred.
Yeah,
Jenny, I want to tie that into what you just said about three things. Number one, there was rumors that they had evacuated the prison.
Yes.
Number two, that the fishermen were told not to be in the bay that weekend.
Yes,
and number three,
sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
And the last one was when we discussed something in 80, I believe it was 88 or 89, you talked about there was actually British ships off the coast and what their involvement was. So if you could go into those three things, I think they're important and they tie into all this.
Yes, that is true, that the prison authorities did appear to move people out of the way because they seemed to have notification that something was going on that weekend that meant that they would be better off not there. There's no official confirmation of that, but there was a lot of unofficial confirmation that tied together, so I have no doubt that happened. Secondly, I have seen documentation which shows that there was instructions issued to shipping off the area, particularly military shipping, to keep out of the way because things were going on that weekend that they needed to be some distance away from the coast when they did happen. And also that personnel on board the ship were asked to be kept below decks whilst certain time periods of that weekend were occurring.
And Jenny, I wondered if I could ask you about page 121 in your excellent book, From Out of the Blue, where you have a sketch by Steve Roberts, and it shows a craft on tripod legs, and there are two beings being dropped down or raised one way or the other out of this craft. Could you explain the story of Steve Roberts and what he told you about this sketch that he made of the craft on tripod legs with a beam putting some kind of little beings down or up?
I think that's a question best asked of Brenda Butler, because she was the one with the closest contact and knowledge of Steve Roberts. And I think her judgment on what his testimony says and how credible it is in the light of many years now that's passed, I think is probably the one to go for. I can offer my personal view, but it would just be a personal view.
Well, we'll ask her in that next hour, but could you just explain for listeners what you know about Steve Roberts and what might have happened involving a craft and beings in Rendlesham Forest?
I only know that Steve Roberts was the first person off the base to talk about the case to anybody, so far as we know, and that happened within a week of the incident, and that he gave the date of the first event as the 26th, the early hours of the 26th, a date which at that time didn't match what most other people were saying, but which of course we now know to be true. So that's in his favour. But he was also repeatedly talking about various things that many other witnesses have never mentioned and have actually denounced as being impossible, including he was always insistent that a major event took place which it appeared to be that the military were expecting and were ready for to film and so on and so forth, and that the actual overall base commander was there and was involved in some kind of communication with the entities involved. Now, this was a story that at that time was so at odds with what everybody else was telling us that it was difficult to know what to make of it. And to this day, I don't know why he has told a story of that kind which is so different from everyone else's. As I say, my judgment really is one that I prefer to make on the overall balance of the evidence from all of the witnesses, rather than pick out an individual and say, well, he said this and therefore we have to accept it as true. I have nothing else that I can match against his testimony for some of the things that he said that would make me personally put his evidence above anybody else's.
Well, Jenny, we did an exclusive interview on Phenomenon Radio in August with Adrian Bustinza, who was a sergeant there, and you discuss him in this book under a different name.
Yes.
And Adrian went on the record in 2 hours with his own experiences now, finally, in which he detailed how he was intimidated and basically threatened. Bullets are cheap. That is the quote. Bullets are cheap. This is Adrian Bustinza on the record in August, when the men, he did not know who they were, and they seemed to be using light in a way to silhouette them, and that when the threat was made, it had to do with what Adrian had seen and experienced in Rendlesham Forest on 2 different nights, December 27th and December 28th. The one on December 28th involving his saying on the record that when he fell to the ground, he could see a red-orange light engulfing John Burroughs. Now, in his detailed discussion, Adrian is basically stressing that the intimidation by the authorities at RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge was so great to those who had firsthand knowledge, and that I know down to even the airmen, a couple that I have interviewed, they said that right after December 26th, that there was like rumors going around, keep your mouth shut. And everybody began to be nervous and intimidated, even if they didn't have a lot of firsthand information. That goes to the heart of the issue that people who were under military control were telling nothing or completely weird versions like the lighthouse as a misinformation, while people who were in the civilian community were probably, in some regards, telling more of the truth right after December 26th to 28th.
That's true to a degree, and I think also stories came out from base public affairs, which had a lot to do with some of the misinformation that occurred in the early days. It's also worth remembering that some of the witnesses stopped talking. We spent a long time searching for a farmer who had told us from very early days that his cattle had been crossing one of the roads into a field at the time when these events occurred, and they had been completely spooked by these things as they came over. And they reported it to the base and asked them what's going on and what are you going to do about the fact that you've caused these problems for my cows. And they were very, at first, non-committal. Then they became more cooperative. And eventually, apparently, he says, they paid compensation to him on the grounds that they should have been protecting him. But then he disappeared and we had to track him down. He'd moved a very long way away and he became extremely reluctant to talk about what had happened. And he just confirmed that, yes, he had basically been paid off by the US Air Force in order not to talk any further about what had happened to him. And that's why you've never heard him publicly talking about the footprint. So it did happen to some degree with members of the public as well. Also, bear in mind that I got a call from a government scientist who was working on an investigation into the alleged burn-up of the Soviet satellites that occurred earlier in the night, about 8 minutes past 9 on Christmas Eve, on Christmas night, 25th of December. And he came to me telling me that he had no interest in UFOs. He'd been put on to me by a contact who said that he should talk to me because of my knowledge of what happened later in the night. And that he had investigated and found, to his great surprise, that something very strange was indeed going on here. And he issued quite dire warnings to me. He basically told me that if what he thought was right that had happened here was true, it was a major government scandal, and that the truth if it ever came out would cause a great deal of international attention. And he used the exact words, "You're messing with something for which you can end up at the bottom of the Thames. I'd leave it alone if I were you."
Wow. And did you ever understand specifically what he thought or was communicating was the most sensitive piece that you would be killed and end up in the bottom of the Thames for investigating?
He is a scientist who's heavily involved in developing new space technology. I think he believed at that point, now whether he does to this day, I don't know, because he has said subsequently that that comment to me was a joke. Believe me, it didn't come over as a joke at that time. I can't say what was in his mind, of course, but he's a very good actor, but it was intended as a joke at the time.
Well, remember, Adrian Bustinza was threatened with bullets are cheap.
Yes, and I think that he believed that it was something to do with the presence of the Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron at the base, and that they were aware of the presence of a Soviet satellite, which actually came down in the early hours of the 27th, and that they thought that had some secret hardware on there, and that they were developing some kind of technology that might be capable of actually shooting it down or interfering with its communication with computers and so on, or whatever. And he had found anomalies in the data connected with the re-entry of that particular satellite, which suggested its course had been altered in some way by means as yet unknown. That's about all he really said to me at the time, and I think he decided enough was enough and he wasn't going to get involved in investigating that anymore. Perhaps he did, and perhaps he decided that his clues were not leading him anywhere. I don't know, because as I say, he's backtracked from all of this and now says it was all just a joke. But I think at the time he suspected something like that might have been going on. Doesn't mean that is what happened, but I think he was really genuinely of the mind that some big government experiment of some kind had happened that weekend, and that the UFO events were not exactly peripheral to it, but were either being used as a smokescreen to cover that, or were part and parcel of the side effects of the experiment, which had been created in ways that nobody had anticipated at the time.
Hey, Jenny, I wanted to add a couple of things to this through my research. Number one, were you aware that Martlesham Heath used to be an active airfield?
Yeah.
So, like a lot of people over the years has stated, well, the 67th was down on those 3 nights, which they were at the base itself, but they could have had helicopter staged at Martlesham Heath.
Yeah.
And the second part is that I don't know how much you looked into the commander at the time of the 67th, but his name was Colonel Wicker or whatever it was. And in his bio, it states his specialty was recovery of downed satellites.
Yeah.
Were you aware of both of that?
I was aware of that, and there are an awful lot of clues and bits and pieces of information like this that can be made to tie together if you're of a mind to do so. That's the fascination of this whole case, that if you want to, you can create about 3 or 4 different scenarios which fit some of the facts. It's making all of the facts fit all of the scenarios that's the problem, and that's why so many years later we're still intrigued by what's going on. All I know for absolute certainty is that it was not just a lighthouse and some meteors. This is a much bigger case than that.
And
Okay.
Jenny, is it possible that Cobra missed in some of those projects that were ongoing in that region at that time in December of 1980 may have been interacting electromagnetically with the environment around, let's say, underground or above ground in that RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge area, and that might itself have opened up some focus for extraterrestrial biological entities, whether in a drone or a manned craft from underneath the ocean, to actually focus on Rendlesham Forest for those 72 hours.
I do think it's possible that experiments of that kind were going on. There is evidence for that. There were incidents involving RAF aircraft, for instance, flying over that area, where they suddenly lost all electrical power and fell into the ocean. And they were never able to explain exactly how or why that happened. But you can correlate them with test dates of some of these research experiments that were going on Norfolk Ness at the time. And I think there's a lot more to come out about that in due course. I also think that what those experiments were doing and what they were capable of doing to our environment, and perhaps even to the nature of space and time itself, has yet to be revealed. And I think that might well be why a lot of the problems surrounding this case occur, because we are dealing with a potential technology here that did things that nobody anticipated it was capable of doing. And as a consequence, it has become a very big secret, and anything directly or indirectly associated with it, in other words, an experience that it might have made possible simply by having occurred for some other reason, might well itself then be subject to all kinds of very strange shenanigans as they try and find ways to discredit witnesses and demonstrate that what did happen couldn't have happened, when in fact what they're really trying to hide is something underlying that they've been doing all the time. And there is good reason to suspect that that was true, yes.
Jenny, a couple questions. First, before I want to get into the Oz factor in the time travel books that you wrote, but I'm sure you're aware of Project Condign. Yeah. I'd like to get your take on it, and also, why do you think Rendlesham was mentioned within this project?
Well, I think there's evidence within it of the physiological effects and of the presence of a very obvious, to me, electromagnetic field, which is clearly associated with some UFO or what some people prefer to call UAP events. And therefore, that was the line that they were really taking. The whole point of the Condign project really was to demonstrate that there might be something physically real behind UFO events that we haven't yet fully understood, that potentially it might be a threat to aircraft and air travel, and that therefore it was worth doing research into. And therefore, they were looking for cases with actual tangible evidence as opposed to just dependent upon eyewitness testimony. And the consistency of these kinds of electromagnetic reports are extraordinary. For example, my very first contact really with anything connected with the Rendlesham Forest case wasn't the phone call from the radar officer. It was actually a witness who had seen something on the night of the 25th, 26th of December from northern Portugal, who contacted me in the first few days of January. Now, I had no way of knowing when that happened, but that was anything to do at all with the Rendlesham Forest case. And in many senses, maybe it hasn't. But what they described was an extraordinary encounter with what most people would say had to be one of those re-entries or fireballs or whatever that occurred on that particular night because of the way the timing seemed to match. But yet their experience of it was so bizarre that it called that entirely into question. For example, there were two men. They were on the coast, northern coast of Portugal, so well south of England, several hundred miles away. And they saw this object come across the sky, change course, which obviously no re-entry or fireball meteor can do, and then head off out in the opposite direction. It passed directly over their heads. And as it did so, it caused their skins to tingle, their eyes to water, and they ended up for the next 2-3 days with a red rash on their skins, which they believed was caused by the presence of this thing. It was relatively low. They saw its reflection in the ocean as it went above them and beyond, heading off towards what would be that southern eastern coast of England. And they described almost identically these physical symptoms that so many people do in the presence of this kind of object.
Wow. So one of the things that became clear, and I noticed early on you said that there are files that they're probably placed somewhere else that are hidden under different nomenclature or whatever. But one of the things, when I did some inquiries with the MOD over the last couple of years, and I've eventually got sectioned where they won't even talk to me now until these 18 files that they all of a sudden got caught red-handed still holding on to, was what was interesting in them. At a certain point, they changed their files from UFOs to UAPs, yeah, and that they're holding 6 policy files. And the other thing about it is that a lot of this stuff, including Condign, is still redacted, which means it's still classified. I'd like to get your take on that, being that you're from the UK, and what you think about that, and do you think that's where some of this stuff could be hidden?
Oh, I think a lot of the files are redacted mainly because they will touch upon secret experimental projects that have either originated out of UFO research or have caused UFO sightings, and therefore they have a problem in discussing them in any open way. I've investigated many cases where I'm absolutely certain that what was involved was some kind of experimental project. And in a country like Britain, which is relatively densely populated, it's a small island with a lot of people on it, it's almost impossible to keep any kind of secret experiment away from prying eyes. In America, it's much easier because you've got large areas of desert where you can do that. You've got plenty of locations to get away from many people. But that's not the case in Britain, so it becomes harder. And I think, therefore, there are two ways this can work. One, they can create something which is built upon information that they've gathered from the UFO data that they've collected over the years. And they are still collecting UFO data. They have officially closed their project, but of course we all know they haven't. It's just gone underground, gone under a different name, and that research that was going on before is still going on because they know it can benefit them, and therefore they don't want to lose access to this information. The other way is that they can actually create something, test something, and try something, and it can be very useful for them to actually use the UFO phenomenon as a cover for that. So they're happy if people report what they create as a UFO phenomenon. I know one specific example. Way back in the early 1980s, there was a sighting quite close to the Air Force base at Lakenheath, which is just a bit north from where Randles Forest is. And the person who reported it to me was a government scientist. She was extremely well connected, very educated. And I knew from her sighting that she'd seen something quite extraordinary. And she gave me a good detailed account of this. The base itself categorically denied any knowledge of it, any connection with it, etc., etc. Years later, I was actually giving a lecture to an RAF base, and senior officers there took me on one side afterwards at the dinner and said, "You know that story you talked about? I think we can explain it to you now, because I don't think it's now an official secret, but it was then." And they explained to me that it was some kind of an experimental drone that they were trying to control with electronics, and it had got out of control and had wandered off across the main road, and they had a few moments of panic until they got it back under control, terrified that someone was actually going to see it. And unfortunately, somebody did. But they realized that it was being reported as a UFO. They were very happy with that conclusion, and they allowed that story to develop because it meant nobody dug into what the reality of what was going on.
Understand. Now, I'd like to go into the Oz factor and what you wrote about it, and do you think it might have played something or had something to do with the Rendlesham case itself?
Well, the Oz factor is really just a name I invented just to cover the fact that so many witnesses were describing to me pretty much exactly the same scenario, where when they were in close proximity to the UFO, it never happened at distance. It always involved someone very close, so it meant that it was something connected with you being very near to whatever energy was being emitted by these things. And they would describe how they suddenly realized that they had lost all sense of time and space, that they felt very strange, that there was a tingling sensation, that their whole body seemed to be charged with electricity, that their hair was standing on end. There were a whole collection of physical and psychological symptoms that were consistently being reported by these people, completely unaware that others were telling the same kind of story. And so I started to compile cases of this type and look for patterns between them. And what I noticed was that very often they seemed to involve what you might call time anomalies, that there was a jump in time or a period of time lost or a complete space out where 1 minute they were in one location, the next minute they were in another, and they didn't know how they got from A to B or how time had disappeared. This happened exactly, and funnily enough, 4 weeks to the day before the Randles Forest case, when one of Britain's other major cases, probably Britain's best known alien abduction case, took place, involving a police officer in a patrol car, and he had the same kind of Oz factor experience while he was stopped directly in front of this thing, hovering just feet away from him above the road. And then he had this jump in time, jump in space, where a period of time disappeared, and where he found himself completely spaced out, stood in the road, looking into a field with no memory of how he got there. And so these things are so consistent that I know that they're a crucial key to what is going on here. And they pointed in the direction that time was a factor in this, and that that's what we need to be looking at. Why space and time are distorted, and what it is that's creating this anomaly. that makes people experience time in a different way during these close encounters.
So the Oz factor is the non-ionizing radiation that is described in Project Condign as being able to, quote, manipulate human minds and damage human tissues.
I think it might be triggered by that. I don't think it's actually that. The Oz factor to me is, as I say, that the entire experience of the witnesses. It covers a range of things. Some of them are physical, some of them are psychological, but they're not, I don't think, all necessarily directly induced within the mind in the same way as you can put someone under a strong ionizing radiation field and maybe get them to hallucinate. That might be a part of it. That might even be something that the powers that be, and certainly probably the military powers that be, have sensed as a way to actually do experiments that can be beneficial in warfare. And I can envisage situations where that might have occurred. But I don't think it's absolutely the key to this. I think it points us in the direction of a phenomenon, origin of which we still don't yet know, which is creating these things. And I think that that's probably why something like the Condign report existed, because they recognize, hey, this is something out there we don't understand. It's got great physical potential. We can harness this and do things with it. And an awful lot of what goes on regarding UFO secrecy has nothing to do with the nature and origin of the UFOs themselves, and an awful lot to do with what they think they can do with it and what kind of weapon they can make out of it.
Thanks, Jenny. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So after 35 years, can you sum up your opinion of Rendlesham in the last 2 minutes?
I think that this is a case that will continue to baffle people for many years. I think it will always be talked about as one of the great cases of the UFO phenomenon. The people in this country, most of whom believe it was completely explained away as nonsense, are entitled to that view. And I think there's elements of truth in that, because I think some parts of it probably were. But they're completely missing the real significance of this event. They have to look deeper and understand that this is a genuine close encounter, that witnesses did see something right in their midst that potentially is very significant, and that we ought to be finding out about, because if we don't, it can happen again tomorrow, and who knows what the consequences of that will be.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for coming on. We really appreciate it.
I was going to do it because if it was anybody, I would have done it for John. I wouldn't have done it for anybody else.
Thanks, Jenny.
Jenny, thank you very much for joining us on Phenomenon Radio today with this very important historic context to RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge. And after this break, we will be back with your colleagues Dot Street and Brenda Butler.
You're listening to the KGRA digital broadcast station, Van Buren, Arkansas, Sarasota, Florida. We begin hour 2 of tonight's interview with Dot Street in just a moment. But first, it's time for Phenomenon News, brought to you by Earthfiles.com with Linda Moulton Howe.
4,500 years ago, the 4th dynasty Great Pyramid of Giza, also known as Cheops or Khufu, was miraculously constructed with hundreds of heavy limestone blocks. The height of Cheops is 455.5 feet, and the base width is 755 feet 7 inches. A great puzzle has been the exquisite precision with which each block tightly fits with each other, even around tunnels inside the pyramid. Now, this week, an international team of architects and researchers from Egypt, France, Canada, and Japan announced that heat anomalies have been found in some of the Great Pyramid limestones. Their collaboration is called the Scan Pyramids Project, which began on October 25th, when FLIR infrared thermographic scanning cameras were turned on day and night to study Cheops. The thermal scanning found that 3 of the blocks were hotter than others. One possible explanation is there are empty spaces behind the warmer limestones where air can circulate and change temperatures. Archaeologists point out that the most impressive heat anomaly is on the eastern side of the Cheops pyramid at ground level. That eastern side in the 4th dynasty would be the front entrance to the pyramid. Would treasures have been deliberately placed in a secret chamber at that eastern front entrance? Or could the heat anomalies be spaces created by construction from the inside out of that great pyramid? Professor John Darnell, a Yale University Egyptologist, told me on November 10th that being able to use thermal scanning to see into the Cheops pyramid as never before could mean that after 4,500 years, we might finally be able to understand how the last remaining 7th wonder of the ancient world was built. For more in-depth information, maps, and photographs, please see my news website, Earthfiles.com.
Thank you, Linda. And that's the news brought to you by Earthfiles.com. And leading off Hour 2's interview with our very special guest, Dot Street, is John Burroughs. John?
Thanks, Race. Dot, welcome aboard Phenomenon Radio. It's 35 years. It's hard to believe. And I want to thank you for coming on. And I'd like to start with the first question of how did you first find out about Randles?
Brenda and Chris Penny. Brenda phoned me up just after Christmas Day that she'd heard from we called Steve Roberts, as you know he doesn't want to be named properly, and said that he'd been in touch with Chris and Brenda saying something had happened in Rendlesham Forest where craft had come down and aliens had been seen. Obviously, it's a lot to take on board. And then when I talked to Chris Penny, the same there. And then I got back to Brenda. I said, right, let's check this out. I phoned up Jenny Randles, our Jen, bless her. She was busy writing a book, put me in touch with someone else who thought I was daft. I thought, right, I'm not getting far there. Got back to Brenda. I said, we need to get on that base to find out what's going on, which eventually we did. We went to the base location. They said, you need to see Squadron Leader John Moulton. We said, fair enough. Hence, we got to see Squadron Leader Moulton, and he confirmed everything. I mean, he got to the point where he asked his secretary for the UFO files. I thought, that's a new one on me. So that started from there and got us buzzing. Then eventually we got in touch with Larry Fawcett. Got in touch with a list of names, which John, your name was on. Larry Warren, Steve Roberts, the lot. And the list was endless. Sadly, I can't find it. And that is going to tell us everything what went on. My hat's off to John, Jim, and everyone that have come forward on this. Bless you all.
Thank you, Dot. Now let's go back.
Okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Let's go back and let's talk about what was described to you at the beginning when the person came forward and started talking to you about it. Did he give you a time frame? What happened? What they saw? Can you go into some of that for us?
Well, obviously it's Steve Roberts. Basically, he did come up. Steve Roberts was continually coming up to my place. Was still in the Air Force. Couldn't tell me. But he did, with Brenda, say part of what happened. He wouldn't totally confirm to me in person what had happened. But the fear on his face was enough. And I said, one day you will tell me the truth on this. He had one conversation with me and he said, oh, it did happen. And I said, thank you for being truthful to me and Brenda and Chris.
Right. Did he give you any dates or times, or did he just tell you something happened?
Yeah, because when Brenda and I were doing the investigation on it, we was getting all these different dates, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th. Where's all this coming from? It's only supposed to have happened over about 2 nights. But what we didn't realise, it was happening over the midnight hour, which you got, say, 26th, 27th. That is the midnight hour, because after midnight it goes into another day. Then we realised that's what was going on. And the more you guys came forward, we was getting a time frame of where the incident was happening, say, I believe, round about 11 o'clock, and still going on after midnight to about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So that's where you get your dates from.
I see. Now, right after the incident, you guys were the first ones to start interviewing people. Can you go into some of the people you interviewed and what they told you early on, besides Steve Roberts?
Well, civilians, obviously, because Brenda did quite a bit with the civilians, although I was with her, with some of them. At the field, there's a field where this went into. There is a family called the Bose family, and they had, Mr. Bose, he had his granddaughter staying there. And from her bedroom window, she turned round, because she was playing with her Christmas toys, looked out of her window and saw bright lights. And she was saying, she went down to her granddad to tell him that this, she was talking about children in a field, not little people or anything, just children. And he wouldn't believe her, told her to go back to bed, but she was persistent.
Okay.
And eventually he came up and looked through the window and he saw it himself. He looked and he said she was telling the truth. But obviously the next day there was, I'm not going to say men in black, but there was people coming around that stopped him talking. His granddaughter saw me and Brenda can confirm this, where he went to interview him, and he would not let us talk to her. I think it's the anniversary of Randles. She didn't want to be known. Obviously, by then she's 30 odd, and confirmed. She said, "I'm glad I've got to meet you, Doc." I said, "So am I." I said, "I'm sorry we couldn't talk," but she said, just talking to me was like lifting something off her head. That was that last civilian. Also, there was a chap in the bungalow, in the house just opposite the field, which pictures are being taken of, where he saw it all, and the craft and the aliens, and he was so scared he hid under the bed. And again, he's another one that was told to be quiet.
Dot, there's been a discrepancy over the years on what area this incident happened. From what I read and stuff, you spent a lot of time out in the forest. Can you give us an idea if you went to the site that was put in the book and exactly what area it was in?
Yeah. Well, obviously you guys were at the East Gate. What you can see from there is like a strobe light as such in the sky. But because it was foggy, somewhat foggy that night, it will look a bit weird. But, you guys knew what was going on. There was something not right. You did the right thing going out there. You went from the East Gate to the top of the forest, Brindlesham Forest, where you saw what you saw. And it went through the trees, then went into the field where it landed. And from what I've gathered from a lot of the higher-ranking officers that I've spoke to, it did land and with high-ranking officers.
Okay. Now, you had a chance, you and Brenda, and I believe Jenny too, to talk to Colonel Hall about some of this. What did he tell you early on?
Sorry, I put a laugh on this one. Bless him. When it was Larry Fawcett that was told me, you need to see Colonel Holt. Apparently he's involved. He was talking to me, don't talk to me in riddles and all the rest of it. I've got that conversation I've got on tape, and I've still got it, which will be put in my book. And I say book, it will be audio. It's a conversation between me and Holt. As I say, I wasn't secretly doing it. Nobody asked what I was doing. I just phoned him. But Holt turned around and said, "Well, I'll speak to you." I said, "Right." I got a time when to meet him, and I got Brenda to be there, because you're an investigator on something like this. You need two of you to confirm it, which we did. he got on quite well with Brenda, but he didn't. I think because I'm a bit pushy, he wasn't going to say a lot. But he wasn't the easiest person to communicate with at the time. I've since met Howe, and he has confirmed what happened. And he said, "I've got no grief with you, Dot." I said, "Whatever." But one of the things that did happen is Brenda and I met up with Colonel Holt's son, and that chap, and it was Holt Jr., was a miner of information. I didn't ask his son for information. He gave it freely. He took me and Brenda out to the site and said that's where his dad took him. So, yes, Holt was involved at some point, but not all of it.
Yeah, I'd like to know a little bit what he told you. Can you describe some of what he told you happened?
I think he might have told Brenda possibly more than me. He wasn't very talkative to me as he was Brenda. But he was basically just admitting it, that he was there. He didn't say a lot to me. Brenda's the one. Well, Brenda's the one that's going to tell you more of what Colonel Holt said.
Okay.
And, well, she confirmed what his son said.
Okay.
So I can't say an awful lot on that. But all I can confirm is where he's telling the truth and where he isn't.
Okay.
And I don't mean that maliciously.
Okay. All right. So of all the interviews you've done and everything that you've talked to people about, can you give us a synopsis of what you think took place 35 years ago now?
It's weird, really, John, because when you go down there, you're walking behind you, and it was like you was reenacting it. And I will never, ever forget the fear. Or actually, it might have been Jim, you and Jim. The fear that you guys had in your faces. You was truly reliving that. And I thought, these guys are so true, it's unreal. It's just one of those places, it draws you to it. Every time I go down there, I mean, I'm getting to the point where I'd like to move and go down there. It sounds daft.
Right.
But there's something about that area.
Right. I understand, Dot. Well, listen, Dot, what I want to do is thank you for coming on today, and have a happy holidays. Like I said before, hopefully I'll see you next spring.
You will, John. Can't thank you enough for what you've done.
Well, I appreciate that,
Bless
Dot.
you.
I can't thank you enough for what you guys did early on to keep this going. So,
just want you to know that we're with you on this. It's been tough for you.
Thanks.
More
really
so for you guys than it has for me and Brenda.
Right.
Bless you.
Really appreciate it, Dot. Have a great holidays. See you in the spring. Thanks, Dot.
Thank you, darling.
Thanks.
And thank you to the radio station for letting us talk. Bless you.
Thanks, Dot.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Dot. This is Phenomenon Radio Live, folks. We'll be right back with Brenda Butler right after these messages.
Around the world for decades have come high strangeness reports of mysterious aerial lights, beams, animal mutilations, human abductions, secret space and military programs focused on an alien presence. One reporter of these Earth mysteries is Emmy Award-winning TV producer, writer, and editor Linda Moulton Howe. She reports and edits the science, environment, and real X-Files news website, Earthfiles.com.
We are moving from the paradigm that we are alone in the universe to a new one in which we are not alone. And something out there is interacting with us, our animals and plant life, forcing glimpses of other realities upon us.
Linda has produced 4 large books about these phenomena with hundreds of color images and illustrations that reviewers such as New York Times best-selling author Jim Marrs describes as an amazing accumulation of evidence. All her books, An Alien Harvest, the 2-volume Glimpses of Other Realities, and Mysterious Lights and Crop Circles, along with documentaries, are available in the shop at Earthfiles.com.
Live alternative talk Talk radio in over 125 countries across Mother Earth. KGRAradio.com.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio Live, right here on KGRA. We're in the third segment with the third special guest tonight, Brenda Butler. But first, if you want to find more on Phenomenon Radio, visit the website at phenomenonradio.com. Also find us on Facebook and Twitter. All right, leading off the third segment of tonight's program, here's John Burroughs.
Thanks, Race. Brenda Butler, it's been a long time. It's 35 years. Thanks for coming on Phenomenon Radio to talk about it. And my first question to you is, how did you first find out about the incident itself?
Well, we lived at Aldringham on the farm at the time, and on December the 31st, 1980, my partner, who was Chris Penny at the time, we were having a New Year's Eve party, and we invited a lot of Americans from the base because Chris was a musician on the base. And one of the people who we invited was Steve Roberts, who we all know now as J.D. Ingalls. And when he came, he said to Chris, could he speak to me? Because he had some information for me about something that had happened down the forest. And I came to the door and he started to tell me about the incident about a craft coming down in the forest, or an incident that had happened in the forest. As we had quite a few more Americans there from the base, I said to him, would you like to come and see me at my house? And on January the 2nd, J.D. Ingalls turned up at my house, and he told me that there had been an incident in the forest down at Randles, and they thought that was some sort of craft that had come down and either crash landed or they had landed. And from there on, I didn't really believe him at first. I thought he was joking because I'd known J.D. for quite a long time, for several years, and we were always talking about UFOs and different things. And so he came in and we got talking about it, and he said, well, please don't say anything to anybody at the moment until we find out more about it. I promised him I would never ever release his name, which I never have done. I promised him I wouldn't say anything about it until I checked into it more. And as the days went by, more and more people were talking about it. One was the guy who went rabbit catching in the forest, and he lived just up the road from me. He told me about it, and then the electrician who mended the runway lights told me about it. And then there was some more Americans who lived here in Leiston, and they were phoning me up telling me about it. And so I let about a month go by before I got in touch with Dot and asked Dot if she wanted to go down and investigate it with me. And that's how it all got started.
Okay, now, can you go into some details of what you were told early on by J.D. and then some of the people that lived around the base, the civilians?
A lot of the people were telling us that they'd seen lights in the sky and that they'd seen something come down and land in the forest. J.D. basically just said that there had been a craft come down, landed in the forest. At first they thought that was an aircraft, and then when that was investigated and some of the security guys went out to see it, there was a craft in the forest, and then it moved and it went into the field. They were the very first tales that we heard, the stories we'd heard. But a lot of the British witnesses who we went to interview, and we went round to see them, they were telling us that they just saw lights in the sky and they didn't see any craft come down at all. Now, before the News of the World 1983 came out, in October 1983, there was quite a few British people telling us and phoning me up, and even the police station here in Leiston, they were phoning up to say that they'd seen a lot of weird things happening down there. The little boy who was walking his dog along the Bordsey Orford beach, he went home, running home, told his mum that he'd seen some green lights coming out of a big dust cloud in the sky and going down onto the sea. And his mum got in touch with the police, who then got in touch with me, and I went and interviewed her. And then the fishermen started saying they'd seen all these weird lights come out of the sky and go down onto the sea. And from there on, we were just sort of like interviewing and going round and researching everything that we could locally at Ike, at Tunstall, and all around. Most people were telling us the same story about lights being seen in the sky and coming across the sky.
Okay. Now, early on, now this is kind of important, did you get a sense, because I know after the Halt memo came out, the dates were different than the statements now show. Did you get a sense, or did anybody give you an idea of approximately what dates had happened and what times this all started?
Yes, nearly every single person that we spoke to was the 27th and 28th, about 11 o'clock at night. Okay. And that was nearly everybody we spoke to. What about JD? Because he would have been talking about our incident. Did he give you a time or a date? He said the 27th. Okay. And that was about 11 o'clock at night. Okay. All right, so that would have been the third night with Colonel Halt. Okay. One of the other questions I have for you, when you did your investigation, there was talk about Dot just got done saying she didn't want to call Men in Black, but there was people that came from the government early on and started asking questions. Did you come across that, and did you talk to any of the people about that? Yes, that is quite true what Dot says. We went around to several of the local people, and the very first time we went round, they were talking to us, and they were telling us that there'd been lights in the sky. They were telling us they'd heard things down at Ike Village and what they'd heard and everything. And then the next time we went round and we saw them, they wouldn't speak to us because they said that they weren't men in black, but there was two men in suits had gone round, interviewed them, asking them what they'd heard, if they'd seen anything, and told them if they had, they'd got to be kept quiet. Now, the two elderly people who lived in the cottage right opposite the forest, they told us right from the start that they heard English people, British people, and Americans talking. They saw a helicopter come over with something hanging from chains on the bottom of it, which looked like an ice cream cone upside down. It hit the runway light, the end runway light. It wobbled over into the far forest and dropped whatever it was underneath into the forest. That was their story. And then the next time we went to see them, all their grounds and their house was all cordoned off with red and white tape with MOD property keep out. And we tried to get in to see them, and eventually we did get in to see them. And I said, oh no, what we meant to say was there was a ghost going up and down the runway. And they wouldn't repeat the story about the helicopter with something underneath it anymore. Okay. Now, did they give you an idea of what night that might have been? They said it was about 2 or 3 days after Christmas, and they couldn't really remember, but they did say it was about 2 or 3 days after Christmas. They could remember that because they'd had company, and their company hadn't left long. Okay. So it wouldn't have been like the 25th into the 26th then, so... Well, I guess it must have been the 26th, 27th, because they said 2 or 3 days after Christmas, which Christmas is 25th, so it must have been the 27th, 26th, 27th. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Now, as you went along, you guys had a chance to, well, first of all, before we get into the interviewing the different people, the area, okay, there's been a lot of discussion on what is the correct area. Now, Colonel Halt at one point has done a radio show, or a TV show actually, where he said there were false spots laid out. Early on, where were you taken to and shown the area was that Colonel Halt was out investigating the night he had his incident? Do you remember? Yes, the very first person to take us out there was JD. Mm-hmm. The second person to take us out there was Colonel Halt's son. And they took us to the same place. JD and Colonel Halt's son took us to the exact same place where that UFO is now, the sculpture of the UFO. That's the place we've always called Colonel Halt's place. And Dot and I showed Colonel Halt a map when we went to see him. And I asked him to put a cross on the map where it was, and he put a cross on the exact same place as where that sculpture of the UFO is now. Okay, can you describe where that is? Because I haven't been there since they put it out. It's down track 10, you know, the track which goes down opposite the old people's cottages. It's down track 10, right down to the bottom, and then there's a track which goes off to the right, and it goes up to where you see the lighthouse. Mm-hmm. Halfway up that track, so about 200-300 yards up that track, and then if you go into the forest, about 20, 30 yards, there's a statue or a thing there of the UFO. A sculpture there of the UFO, a great big huge black UFO. And that's where we've always been.
Okay, and that's quite a distance away from Capel Green, correct?
It's practically opposite Capel Green, actually.
Okay, it's opposite Capel Green. Okay.
Yeah.
At any point in time, did anybody talk about something happening down at the other end of the field? Yes.
Larry Warren did. And that's the first place that he took us to.
Okay. All right. Now, based on that picture that was put with Captain Verano and I believe Sergeant Goulias, which area do you believe that picture was taken in?
The area which we call Area 1 now.
Okay. Which is where?
Okay. You come from the left gate, from the east gate. You get down the bottom of the road and you turn left and you go down the road, and then there's a track which goes off to track 7, and you go up there and you go into the forest, and it's about 100 yards or 50 yards, say, into the forest. There's a big place there, nothing's ever grown. We've been going there since about 2000, 2001. Nothing's ever grown there. And the trees were all scratched and had abrasions on them and everything. And we took a Geiger counter there, and we got very high radiation readings there. And Peter got rashes all over his legs from there, and I got rashes all over my arms. And we've both had strokes. And when we went to the hospital, the doctor asked me if I'd been near radiation. I didn't want to tell him, and I said no. But Peter, his legs were all burnt and everything, and he went to the hospital. And the doctor asked him, have you been near any radiation? And he said yes, he had. And he told him all about the Rendlesham Forest thing. And the doctor just looked at him and walked off.
Okay, so somebody that's been out there, if you centered yourself in the forest where the main house is, the farmer's house, as they've always called it, everything you're talking about is to the left of the farmer's house.
No.
Okay, no. It would be to the right of the farmer's house, closer to Capel Green?
No, it's nowhere near Capel Green. It's quite a way. If you stand at the east gate, yeah?
Okay.
And you look across to your left. Yeah, okay. You stand at the east gate and you're looking right across to the left. Okay. It's probably about, 500 yards. It's over the airfield, the other side of the airfield. You know where the big back gate is, what they call the big back gate.
Right, the crash gate.
It's around that area.
Okay, the crash gate. Okay. All right. Okay, so now moving forward from the location, let's talk about some of the different interviews you did with some of the different people and what stood out in the different interviews, if you don't mind going into that.
Okay, well, one of the gentlemen that I met in the forest in 1987, he lived at Bordsey, and he lived his house was on the Bordsey cliff tops, and he very often went to the cliff tops because he'd got a telescope, a very high powerful telescope there, and he walked around the forest with me, and he was an ex-MOD man, and we got chatting and everything, and I asked him about the 1980 case, and he said, well, the very interesting thing was that he remembers that over the weekend of Christmas 1980 there was a lot of activity out to sea off Orford and Bordsey. He said that he watched from his clifftop home helicopters searching the sea, and he said there was a ship docked there, which I believe was the HMS Norfolk from Portsmouth, and just beyond the island, and there was a Tupelo bear. He could see the aeroplane going up and down. Well, I know that's true because that was reported on our news, and that was reported on the 27th. That was going up and down our waters. And then we were talking about the Cold War and that, and he said although he thought that people thought this had ended, he didn't think so. And he found this all very, very interesting, but he said he couldn't really say a lot more than that because he was still covered by the Official Secrecy Act. And he asked me not to say anything, not to the newspapers or anything about all of this and what he'd seen, which I said, okay, I wouldn't. Another interesting person that we interviewed was the gentleman who was walking his dog, and once again he said that was on the 27th of December, and he was walking his dog where he always did. He parked down the bottom near Farmer's Boast's house, walked through to the forest and let his dog run around, very often chasing rabbits and that. And on this night he saw lots of lights in the forest. Once again, that was round about where this UFO is in the forest. And his dog sort of started shaking, and he was a bit worried about his dog and everything, so he didn't know what was happening. He hid behind a tree, and he saw, like he said, a missile type shaped thing in a crater, and it looked as though it had either fallen off an aeroplane or it had come down. Anyway, it was in a crater, and he said there was some men dressed like bee catchers, how he put them, but I guess he meant in radiation suits, and he said they were covering this thing up in the forest. And so anyway, he went home. He didn't like to stay there in case he was spotted, and he said there was a helicopter come over. So he got his dog, went home. When he got home, his wife said that he was shaking, he was very, very white. He told her what he'd seen, but he wouldn't speak about it again. When I took Keith Beebe up there from the newspapers and we went to interview him, he wouldn't speak to us, but his wife came and told us what he'd told her. And I don't know why, but not long after that, his wife died. But I mean, that's a coincidence, that is, but his wife died not long after that.
Okay.
That was another one of the interviews that we did. The rabbit catcher, we interviewed the rabbit catcher. He lived here in Leiston, and he came and he told me that there was a lot of trees broken down, or the tops off the trees are broken down, the branches were all broken down, there was a lot of branches all burnt up, and that. And he went to the forestry, and the forestry people told him he weren't supposed to have gone there because that was all, the trees were all got to be chopped down, and a lot of them had radiation on. And that's some of the people. The lady at the Ike shop, we went in to see her and interviewed her, and she said that she had two men go in there and ask her not long after if she'd heard anything, if any of the Americans had gone in there and they had talked to her about any of this. She said no, that they hadn't, and they asked her, well, do you know anything about it? And she said no, she didn't, because basically she didn't want to become involved. But she said she had heard Americans talking about something landing in the forest and there was a fire. But she told them no, she didn't know anything. But when I went in to interview her, that's the story she told me. Other people, there's Andrew Sheepshanks, who's the bloke who phoned Dot up. I don't know if Dot mentioned him to you, but he phoned her up and said that he saw a missile-type shape UFO come over and that he'd like to talk to us about it. Dot phoned up for an appointment and got his dad, and his dad said he didn't know what we were talking about. He hadn't heard anything about it. So we decided to call in to see Andrew on the way down one day. So we called in, and his dad came out and asked us what we wanted, and we told him that we wanted to see Andrew. He said he didn't know anything about any UFO or anything like that, and we weren't going to talk to Andrew for us to get off his property, off his land. So anyway, Dot being Dot kept saying, no, we want to speak to Andrew, and he said, well, Andrew's not here, I'm sorry. So anyway, we see somebody looking out of the window who we thought might be Andrew, but Mr. Sheepshanks kept telling us to get off his land or he was going to call the police. Anyway, we didn't leave it there, because a few days later we went back again, hoping that Mr. Sheepshanks weren't there and we could see Andrew. But Mr. Sheepshanks was there, and he got really annoyed with us, went back indoors, he was going to phone the police. His secretary came out and she said, I think you better go, because he means that he will call the police to get you off his property. So we didn't pursue that any further, we let that one go. Vic, the cowman, who lived in the cottage which overlooks Capel Green, we went to see him on several occasions, and he said that he got the cows in at 3 o'clock in the morning and he didn't see anything at all. He didn't hear anything. The cows gave the normal amount of milk. They weren't upset. They weren't stressed out or anything. So basically we couldn't get any further with him. Then there was the taxi drivers who also, one of them, I believe, gave a talk at one of the Woodbridge dues, and he said that he was coming along the Butley Road and they saw lights in the sky and the roads were all blocked off and there were security men standing there with guns who wouldn't let them through, and they had to stop, and they saw lights in the sky and something coming across the sky, like all stuff dripping off of one of the, he said, the big lights. So they had to turn around and go back. And when they got back to the base, because he had Americans in the car, when he got back to the base, he said that these Americans just said to him, you better not say anything until we find out what is happening. And then there was Steve Cleveland, who was coming along at this time in his car, and he said that he saw a great big lorry or a truck backing up towards the forest, and there was a load of people there and they were putting stuff on to the lorry and covering it up. I can't guarantee actually any of this, what people are saying. I mean, these are just people we've talked to, and these are the stories we have been told. The other couple who were in Daisy Walk at the time, and some of there's a lot of this story is the stories before the News of the World come out. The girl, well, they were in Daisy Walk, probably up to no good, but anyway, the girl looked up out of the car window and she saw lights going over. She screamed. Her boyfriend said, what's the matter? And she said, look up there, look up there. Apparently he got out and had a look, and there was these lights then going over, but they went out towards the sea. But he said he didn't see anything come down. He said it was just like a big black shape with lights on it. And then we talked to a lot of people who walk their dogs around the forest and walked the dogs around the forest over Christmas and Boxing Day. And we talked to quite a few of them as time went by, and they were saying that they didn't see anything. I mean, they said there was cows in the field. The trees were sort of like being knocked down or cut down and that, and the forestry said it was part of what they were doing. But they said they saw no security guards around anywhere. They didn't see anything out of the ordinary when they were walking their dogs and that around the forest.
Okay. Now, what about the military people that you spoke to early on? Can you talk a little bit about who they were and what they told you early on?
Okay, well, we talked to a man by the name of, I think his name was J.D. Chandler. We spoke to him. He lived here in Leicester at the time, and he was telling us that all what he heard, they didn't actually see anything. They heard that there was lights going across the sky, and these lights come down in the forest. I think he worked in the dining room, in the dining hall. There was another man who was Steve. Oh God, I can't remember his last name. Steve. Anyway, he said he was out on the with the aeroplanes and that, and he was supposed to be doing something around the aeroplanes. And he said that what he saw was a big green light come over, and he said that went over towards the forest. But no, he said that came over from where I was just telling you about the back gate and that way. And he said it came straight over top of the runway lights and went out towards the forest. The other man who we talked to, he wasn't American, he was English, and that was Gordon Levitt, who saw the big green octopus type light come over top of his house, the one whose dog got scared. And he said he saw it, and that came over the forest once again. That was the 27th, 28th. I haven't really sort of like followed, to be honest, only you and Jim and Larry basically, and Colonel Holt, because you know, once the story got out and then all the Americans sort of took over and started telling their stories, I more or less concentrated on all the British witnesses.
Okay.
So
now, I'm sorry, Dot did say that you guys had a chance to early on talk to Colonel Holt, and she said you could fill in the details better than her. Could you go ahead and let everybody know what Colonel Holt was saying about the incident early on?
Well, when Dot and I first went to see Colonel Holt, I think he found it a big joke, actually, because we went to see Donald Morland first, you know, the British base commander. we went to see him first, and while we were talking to him, Colonel Holt was listening on his radio. I think they had a two-way radio there, because we could hear him. And anyway, we went to see, he agreed to see us. So we went to see him, but the thing is, Dot had been recording Colonel Holt's, when she was talking to him, she was recording it. So when we actually went there, he was talking to us and everything. He put the cross on the map. He told us that he saw lights in the sky. He didn't see a UFO. He didn't see any aliens or anything, just lights in the sky and lights that come down. He said they went through the forest. He said they didn't land or anything like that. They just went through the forest. And anyway, as we were leaving, he thumped his fists on the desk and said, right, now I want you to tell me the truth, Dot. He said, have you been recording my messages, my telephone calls to you? And she said, no. He said, well, I know you have. He said, because when you record things, he said, there's a little red light go on and off on my telephone to say that I'm being recorded. Well, of course, we believed him, didn't we? And he really upset Dot. And he said to Dot, well, next time you do it, he said, you know, that'll mean jail because it's illegal to do so. Anyway, that was the first time we saw him. And then we went and saw him on several occasions after that, but he always said he had told us the truth. Even though I said to him at one occasion, I said, was it a military exercise? Was it anything like that? You know, was it a bomb? Was it... Anyway, I went through every scenario that I could think of. He said, no, I am telling you girls the truth. He said, it was just lights going through the forest. He said, and that's all what we saw was just lights in the forest. He said, and then they took off, went over the field and went out to sea. He told us that he followed the lights with the other security guards. There was about, well, he's always said there was only 5 of them involved. And he said we went across the field, through a ditch with water in it, and then we went up on a big hill. Well, and then we saw the lights beaming down, and we could see lights flashing, which we guessed was the boat, the lifeboats, or, you know, out there, the ship wash and that, which flashes on red lights. Anyway,
hey, Brenda, before we go further, that hill, how far? Because we talked about this when I came over and visited last time, and that's where I remember ending up at, on the first night. How far was that hill from the East Gate? And what's the name of it?
It must be a good 1.5 miles across fields.
Okay, and what's the name of the field, of the hill?
It's Barrow Mound.
Okay, Barrow Mound. And that's where you can see out to the coast then? Yeah,
because the river runs right beside it. Okay. And right up the coast and right out to sea.
And that would take quite a bit of time to get from the forest, going over the fence, through the fields and out there. Would it not, correct?
Yeah, we went up there about 2 weeks ago and we walked, but we took our car halfway there, then we walked, and it took a good half an hour for us to walk down the muddy lane and up the hill, right on top of the hill. So I guess if you were doing that, that would take a good, I don't know, an hour and a half probably.
Okay, all right. So going back to this now, he said he was at the top of the hill and looked down. What happened after that?
Well, he said when they're at the top of the hill, they see these things coming from the east or the west. Can't remember what he said now, but anyway, they saw all these lights in the sky, and from the top of the hill, they could see lights beaming down, and he could hear on the radio that they were beaming down on the weapons storage unit back on base.
Okay.
But then when I spoke to him, or when I emailed him at one stage, and I told him he'd said this, he said, no, we didn't go on a hill. He said, I don't even know what you're talking about. I said, but you did. I said, that's what you told us. I said, I wrote down everything you said, but he said he didn't. He didn't go up on a hill. So I don't know.
Okay. At any time early on, did he mention to you that he thought it was E.T. or anything else?
No.
Okay.
He never ever mentioned that at all.
Okay. Now, were you there with him when he spoke to Keith Beebe about this?
Yes.
Okay. Did he or did he not tell Keith Beebe he had some paperwork that would show a team came in from overseas?
Yes.
So he did say he had some paperwork?
Yes.
Okay. Did he go into any detail with either one of you on what that paperwork was and where the team came from?
No, he didn't, no.
Okay.
No.
What kept him from showing you guys that paperwork?
Because of the Official Secrecy Act that he'd signed.
But why
Because
why would he bring it up and then not be able to show it to you afterwards? It doesn't make, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but why would he even bring it into the conversation?
But John, he was like that. As his son said, he was a proper hoaxer and a proper joker, and he would say things like that, just to give you a little bite of the cherry and not go any further.
Okay.
He was always doing that.
Now, do you believe he was serious about having some paperwork?
Well, he's even saying now that he's got a lot of paperwork that's never been shown and everything. That's all got to be put in his book. He said he's got a lot of documents that's never been shown, and that'll all be put in his book.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the Official Secrets Act. That's for British personnel, not American, right? But he did mention that?
Yeah. Yes. He was always saying that everybody was covered by the Official Secrecy Act.
So he claimed that all of us were covered by your country's Secret Act.
Yes.
Interesting. And he never elaborated why?
No.
Okay. Anything else early on that he told you other than just seeing lights in the forest?
No, he's never ever admitted that. I've asked him time and time again, especially when he came over last June and we talked about it, and I asked him if he saw ETs, there was ETs involved. He said he did not see ETs, and he said he can't really say what he saw. He said he saw a structured craft, which he did say at first they were just lights in there, but now he's saying it was a structured craft. And he said he can't really say what it was. He don't really know what he saw.
Okay. Now, you also had a meeting with Jim Peniston. Can you go into that for us?
That was right at the beginning, wasn't it? When we first saw Jim. He phoned me up and said that he would, if we wanted to meet with him, we could. But we had to meet in secret off the base. So Dot and I went to meet him, and we met him at the bus stop along the road opposite the Bentwaters there. There's a bus stop. And we met him there, picked him up, he got in the car, and he didn't know at the time, but Dot was in the back of the car covered up by a blanket. She was, because I didn't
believe you. I believe you.
Yeah, it's true, actually.
That's what I mean.
So we drove onto the base, and we parked beside, I think it was the Stars and Stripes or the BX. We parked there anyway. And Jim was telling us that he'd seen a craft and it had got red, white and blue lights on it and everything. And I kept saying, are you sure? Well, anyway, he got annoyed because I went on about secret weapons and different things and that, but I wasn't saying that's what it was. I was just asking him to say that, it wasn't. I was just going through once again all the scenarios. Right. And he said that he had photographs that he'd been given or that he'd found up in an attic, that he'd got a box of photographs, he'd got lots of documents, and if we met again, then if we promised not to say anything, then he would let us have all of these because he think that we should have them for our research. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we said okay then, and there was security guards going round and round, security police going round and round in their Jeep and that, and I think he got a bit worried about this in case he was seen. So anyway, he then got out of the car and Dot and I drove off, and Dot was still covered up in the back of the car with his blanket. I don't think Jim ever knew she was there. We made arrangements to see him again. We had contact about twice after that, not seeing him, but on the phone. We arranged to meet him once again down there, but he never ever turned up. Okay. And he said, when I spoke to him again, he said it was because I was going on about secret weapons and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. So can you give me you've got this all recorded, correct?
We got it all written down, yeah. Okay.
Can you go into did he describe anything, what he saw, what happened, or anything like that?
Well, Jim just said that he saw a craft with lights on it, and one corner was blue, one corner was red, and that was flashing red, white, and blue lights. He said it was a dusty sort of colour, a funny dusty colour, basically, and that stood there on the ground. That's what he was telling us. Okay. We didn't know whether to believe him at the time or not, but.
Okay. So at that point in time, you never talked anything about seeing any glyphs, or it was black and shiny, or gave a real good description. He just gave you a general description of what he saw.
Yeah. No, he didn't say anything about what he's saying now whatsoever. No.
Okay. All right. Now, who else did you talk to that was in the military?
Oh, God, I can't remember, John. We talked to quite a few people there. I phoned up Moulton Hall and asked them, I asked them if you, Jim, or Colonel Holt was to say anything about this, what would happen to you, and they said that you would lose your pension, you would be court-martialed, and nothing must, once again, you were covered by the Official Secrecy Act, and this was Moulton Hall, this was, and, you'd all be court-martialed if anything about this came out and you talked about it. When I told Colonel Holt all of this, because I got it all written down, and when I went out to dinner with him up at Manchester when we were doing talk up there together, he said, "My goodness, you have done your research, haven't you?" I talked to the PR officer up at Moulton Hall.
Public Affairs, right?
Yeah.
So they told you they were aware of the incident then?
Yes.
Okay.
They did.
And did they go into much detail other than just that they were aware something happened?
No.
Okay.
No. They just said that none of you who are involved would be allowed to talk about anything.
Okay. Now, there was one interview that Keith Beebe did that he talked to, I believe it was Colonel Moreland. Were you involved with that?
Yes, Donald Moreland, yes.
Yes. He mentioned that he went into some details about what we might have been involved with, or we saw something and reality and stuff. Do you remember what he said? I don't have it in front of me right away, but he did make some interesting comments about what we may have been dealing with. Did he not?
I know when Dot and I went to see Donald Moreland, he said to us that what the men saw were lights outside the perimeter fence, and he said what they saw were little beings that looked like angels. He said they were like silver and shiny, and they were like little angels. And him and the forestry people and Colonel Holt all said to me and Dot, "You ought to be thinking more technical than what you're thinking." And we couldn't think what that meant. And then Moreland had said, I think what they'd been involved in, because Donald Moreland was very religious, and I think he thought that was something to do with God or something like that was coming and going.
Okay. Now, over the years, or during that time frame, you had some contact with the British government. How did they treat you, first of all? And then I understand after the memo came out, they changed their tune. Can you go into some of that real fast?
Well, we went up to the MOD, Jenny, Dot and myself, because they'd always denied anything had happened, and I'd been phoning them up, I'd been writing to them, and I'd got letters from them to say nothing had happened at all. They hadn't got any reports or anything of anything happening. So when we got the memo, we went up to the MOD, and we sat there for ages and ages, and nobody came. So Jenny got up and she said, well, and started waving the memo about and everything. And somebody soon came then, and we got took into a room behind a great big huge iron type door, and we were asked what this was about and everything, and we told them what that was about. And then this lady, she asked Dot, Jenny and myself if we would sign a document to say that we would not investigate or go to Rendlesham Forest and do any more investigations on that. Jenny and I said that we would if they could confirm to us or tell us what actually happened, and if that was of any danger to our governments or to our airspace or anything. Dot said that she wouldn't sign it. And in the end, that was just standoff, because they wouldn't say anything to us. We said, "Will you tell us what happened then?" And they said, no, they couldn't. So none of us would sign it. And then I spoke to Lord Hill Norton and Glenn Carty. But Glenn Carty, Lord Hill Norton, and I spoke to Ralph Noyes. I went to see all three of them. But Lord Hill Norton said that he couldn't really comment because he would lose his pension if he did. Ralph Noyes said that he really believed that did happen, or something happened, but he weren't sure whether aliens were involved. And Glenn Carty he said practically the same. He said that he was going to look into it and get back to us and that. Well, we went to, Dot and myself went to see him, and his wife was very nice and that, and she said, of course, you know, they can't say anything. She said, that's why. That's all secret and top secret, and they're not allowed to say anything. Basically, so we didn't really get very far with that.
Okay. Well, we're coming up at the end of the hour. In the last couple minutes, it's been 35 years, Brenda. You've been through a lot. You've seen and heard a lot. Can you sum up where you feel Rendlesham is today and where it might end up?
Well, I'm still investigating. I'm still having people come down there, John. People are still talking to me. People are still, saying what they think it was. But I don't know. I've got a funny feeling it's more to do with the Cold War. The Russians out at sea, the Russian submarine, the Russian plane, all for Ireland, microwaves, radiation. Basically, that's what I'm looking into at the moment, because a lot of people are now coming forward and saying more of that than it was ET.
Okay. But then you've got Colonel Halt that you know quite well saying he believes it was ET now. What do you think about that?
Well, Colonel Halt knows my views. I have sent him an email only about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he hasn't answered me. He's continually asking me when I speak to him how far I've got my investigations, what I'm doing, etc., etc. I've told him, and he's gone quiet on me. So I don't know if he cannot talk about it, and if he releases what really happened, and are we going to believe the truth anyway, John? Come on, there's too many stories, too many scenarios. All different.
I don't disagree. I'm sorry. Right.
Sorry.
I don't disagree with you on that. The couple of things one thing that's pending for me is to see how the MOD handles these 18 files they mysteriously forgot about, and some of it does have to do with Rendlesham. Now, basically, the gist of what I'm getting is it's stuff that's already been released. But the fact of the matter is that they told the UK and the world that they had no more files, and then I got them to admit they had 18 more, 6 of them policies, and some of it, shows where they changed from UFOs to UAPs. I think that's important. Plus the fact that Condyne came out, which goes into some detail, which actually Condyne kind of points to some kind of phenomenon that's in the forest that you yourself may have had some interaction with. So, you're right. I think it's up in the air. I've always felt from the very beginning it was something we were doing that drew something in. So, but like I said, I have to agree with you. I don't think the jury's still out on what's going on.
Well, there's a lot of stuff happened, John, that hasn't come out yet. There's an awful lot of stuff that we know that's happened down there. There's things that we've seen down there. Colonel Holt told me at one stage when things were happening to me down there, and he says, oh, my God, be careful because, the agencies and that. And I said, John, Colonel Holt, I'm not scared. I said, that don't bother me. He said, I'm not talking about ETs. I'm talking about government agencies, he said, that are down there and that are around. And we know there's still a lot of stuff going on down there.
Right. Well, Brenda, I want to say thank you for taking the time to talk with us tonight. Really enjoyed having you on. I want to wish you the happy holidays. And I should be back sometime next spring. My son and I are going to come over for a visit for sure. So I'd like to sit down with you again when I get back over there. So
that'll be great, John. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brenda. And enjoy the rest of your evening or early morning. And we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks, John. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Brenda, and thank you, John. Next week on Phenomenon Radio, we will present Chuck DeCaro, who did a 5-part piece for CNN Special Assignments on the Rendlesham case. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, myself, Race Hobbs, Brenda Butler, Jenny Randles, and Dot Street, thank you all for joining us tonight right here on Phenomenon Radio Live, heard exclusively on KGRA Radio, the station that brings you the best choice of alternative talk radio on the World Wide Web. We're KGRAradio.com.